The dust swirled around Jake Morrison's boots as he guided his weathered horse through the narrow canyon pass. The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on his worn leather hat, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. Jake had been riding for 3 days straight, following rumors of trouble brewing near the Apache reservation. As a former cavalry scout turned drifter, he had learned to trust his instincts, and something about the whispered conversations in the last town didn't sit right with him. The year was 1887, and tensions between settlers and Native Americans remained high across the frontier. Jake had seen enough bloodshed during his military days to last a lifetime. Now, at 35, he preferred the solitary life of a wandering cowboy, taking odd jobs and staying out of other people's business. But when he overheard 2 men in a saloon talking about taking care of the Apache problem once and for all, his conscience wouldn't let him ride away. As Jake crested a small hill, he spotted smoke rising from the valley below. His heart sank when he recognized the scene unfolding before him. A makeshift military camp had been erected near a cluster of army tents, and in the center, 7 young Apache women sat bound together near a large wooden post. Their dark hair hung loose around their shoulders, and their traditional dresses were torn and dirty. Even from a distance, Jake could see the fear in their posture. Surrounding the captives were about 20 men, but Jake's experienced eye immediately noticed something wrong. These weren't regular army soldiers. Their uniforms were mismatched, their discipline lacking, and their weapons appeared to be a mixture of military and civilian firearms. The man who seemed to be their leader wore a sergeant's stripes, but his swagger and cruel demeanor reminded Jake more of the outlaws he had encountered than any proper military officer. Jake dismounted and tied his horse to a scraggly mesquite bush, then crawled closer on his belly to get a better view. Through his field glasses, he studied the camp layout and counted the men. The fake sergeant was barking orders at his subordinates, gesturing wildly toward the bound women. Jake's blood ran cold when he saw the man point to a nearby tree with a thick branch extending over the camp. The cowboy had arrived just in time to witness a planned execution disguised as military justice. But Jake knew these women couldn't possibly deserve such a fate. Apache tribes in this region had been peaceful for months, following the recent treaty negotiations. Something else was happening here, something that had nothing to do with legitimate military action. As Jake observed the scene, he noticed one of the fake soldiers arguing with the sergeant. The man's voice carried across the valley, and Jake caught fragments of their heated discussion. Words like payment, land rights, and mining claims drifted to his hiding spot. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't about Apache raids or broken treaties. This was about money and land, the 2 things that drove most evil schemes on the frontier. The 7 sisters appeared to range in age from about 16 to 25. Jake could see family resemblances in their faces, even from his distant position. The eldest sister sat protectively near the youngest, whispering what appeared to be words of comfort. Their courage in the face of certain death reminded Jake of his own sister, who had died of fever when they were children. He made a silent promise that these young women would not meet such a horrible end, not while he still drew breath. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Jake noticed increased activity in the fake military camp. The men were preparing something, and the tension in the air was almost visible. The sergeant walked over to the bound women and spoke to them in broken Apache, his tone mocking and cruel. The eldest sister lifted her chin defiantly and responded in English, her voice clear and strong despite her desperate situation. "We have done nothing wrong," she declared. "Our people have honored the peace treaty. You have no right to hold us here." The sergeant laughed harshly and backhanded her across the face. "You Apache are all the same, always lying, always scheming, but your schemes end here today." Jake's jaw clenched, as he watched the cruel treatment of the defenseless women. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip, but he forced himself to remain patient. Rushing in without a plan would only get everyone killed. He needed to understand the full scope of what he was facing before making his move. The cowboy spent the next hour studying the camp's defenses and the patrol patterns of the guards. Most of the fake soldiers appeared to be drinking heavily, passing around bottles of whiskey as they awaited orders. Their discipline deteriorated as the alcohol took effect, and Jake began to see opportunities developing. As darkness approached, lanterns were lit throughout the camp, creating pools of flickering light and deeper shadows. Jake knew that night would provide his best chance to act, but he also realized that time was running short. The fake sergeant had been consulting his pocket watch frequently, and there was an air of finality to the preparations taking place. Moving carefully through the gathering dusk, Jake worked his way closer to the camp perimeter. He needed to hear more of their conversation to understand exactly what was driving this atrocity. Hidden behind a large boulder, he was finally close enough to make out complete sentences from the men's discussions. The sergeant was talking to a well-dressed man in civilian clothes who had apparently just arrived on horseback. "The deed transfers are ready?" the sergeant asked. "Everything's in order," the civilian replied. "Once those Apache girls are dead, their father's mining claims will revert to the territorial government. My associates in Tucson have already arranged for the claims to be sold to our mining company at a fraction of their true value." Jake felt his anger building as the conspiracy became clear. These 7 sisters weren't random captives. They were the daughters of an Apache man who had legitimately staked valuable mining claims under the new territorial laws. With his daughters dead, the claims would become available for acquisition by corrupt officials and their business partners. The conversation continued, revealing more details of the scheme. The sister's father had been away negotiating with territorial officials about expanding his mining operations when the fake soldiers had kidnapped his daughters. The plan was to execute them and claim they had been caught planning raids against nearby settlements. With the father having no male heirs, his mining claims would legally revert to territorial control upon his daughters' deaths. As Jake listened to more of their cruel planning, he learned that similar schemes had been carried out against other Apache families with valuable land holdings. The fake military unit was actually a group of hired killers working for a network of corrupt territorial officials and greedy businessmen. They used the ongoing tensions between settlers and Native Americans as cover for their systematic theft of Apache resources. The youngest sister began crying softly, and her eldest sister started singing a traditional Apache song in a low, comforting voice. The haunting melody drifted across the camp, and even some of the fake soldiers fell silent as they listened. Jake recognized it as a death song, a final act of defiance and spiritual preparation for what seemed like an inevitable fate. But Jake Morrison had other plans. As he crouched in the darkness, studying the layout of the camp and the positions of the guards, he began formulating a rescue strategy. The odds were heavily against him, 20 armed men versus 1 lone cowboy. But Jake had learned during his military service that surprise and determination could often overcome superior numbers. The fake sergeant checked his pocket watch again and called for his men to gather around. "Time to finish this business," he announced. "String up those Apache girls and let's get out of here. We have that payment to collect in Tucson tomorrow." Jake knew he was out of time. In the next few minutes, 7 innocent young women would die horrible deaths unless he acted immediately. Drawing his revolver and checking his ammunition, he prepared to put his hastily formed plan into action. The lone cowboy would soon discover whether his courage and skills were enough to save the 7 Apache sisters from their deadly fate. Jake Morrison moved like a ghost through the desert shadows, his years of scouting experience serving him well as he approached the fake military camp. The drunken guards had become careless, more interested in their whiskey bottles than maintaining proper watch. This gave Jake the opening he desperately needed to begin his dangerous rescue mission. His first target was a sentry posted near the horse corral at the camp's eastern edge. The man was sitting on a wooden crate, rifle leaning against a nearby fence post, while he took long swigs from a bottle. Jake crept up behind him, using the darkness and the sound of restless horses to mask his approach. With practiced precision, he struck the guard at the base of the skull with the butt of his revolver. The man crumpled silently to the ground. Moving quickly, Jake tied up the unconscious guard and dragged him behind a supply wagon where he wouldn't be easily discovered. He then made his way toward the ammunition supplies he had spotted earlier. If he was going to even the odds against 19 remaining enemies, he would need to limit their firepower while creating maximum confusion. The ammunition was stored in wooden crates near the center of camp, unfortunately close to where the 7 sisters remained bound. Jake would have to time his actions perfectly to avoid endangering the women he was trying to save. He pulled several sticks of dynamite from his saddlebags, a leftover from his days helping with railroad construction. The explosives would serve as both weapon and distraction. As Jake prepared his charges, he could hear the fake sergeant continuing to berate his men about their upcoming departure timeline. "I want those Apache girls swinging from that tree in 10 minutes, the man snarled. "Then we break camp and ride hard for Tucson. The boss doesn't like delays, and we've already spent too much time in this godforsaken desert." The cowboy's hands worked steadily despite the mounting pressure. He placed small charges near the ammunition stores and the fake soldiers' supply wagons, timing the fuses to give him enough opportunity to reach the captive sisters before the explosions began. His plan was risky and depended on split-second timing, but desperate situations called for desperate measures. Moving closer to where the sisters were being held, Jake positioned himself behind a large water barrel about 30 yards from their position. From here, he could see their faces clearly in the lantern light. The eldest sister continued to comfort her younger siblings, her voice steady and brave despite their terrifying circumstances. Jake was impressed by her strength and leadership under such impossible conditions. The fake sergeant approached the bound women, coiled rope in his hands. "Time for justice, Apache girls," he said with a cruel smile. "Your people should have stayed on the reservation where they belonged." "Our father has legal mining claims," the eldest sister replied firmly. "We have broken no laws. This is murder, not justice." The sergeant laughed harshly. "Your father's claims will be worthless when you're all dead. Funny how territorial law works, isn't it?" Jake had heard enough. He lit the fuses on his carefully placed charges and began his desperate assault on the camp. His first shots took down 2 guards who were standing near the sisters, creating an opening for his approach. The Colt revolver bucked in his hand as he fired with deadly accuracy, each shot finding its target among the confused fake soldiers. The first explosion erupted near the ammunition supplies, sending men diving for cover as burning debris rained down across the camp. The blast was followed immediately by a second explosion that destroyed the supply wagons and scattered the fake soldiers' equipment. In the chaos that followed, Jake sprinted toward the bound sisters while continuing to fire at any enemy who tried to target him. "Stay down!" Jake shouted to the women as he reached their position. His knife sliced through their bonds with quick, efficient strokes. "When I tell you to run, head for that rocky outcrop to the north. There's cover there." The eldest sister looked up at him with gratitude and determination. "Who are you?" she asked as Jake continued cutting through the ropes. "Someone who believes in justice," Jake replied, freeing the last of the sisters just as several fake soldiers recovered from their initial shock and began returning fire. "Run now! Take your sisters and get to those rocks!" The 7 young women didn't hesitate. Despite their fear and the chaos surrounding them, they moved together toward the safety Jake had indicated. The eldest sister helped the youngest along while the others provided support and protection for their group. Jake provided covering fire, his revolver speaking with deadly authority as he held back the pursuing fake soldiers. The fake sergeant had recovered from his initial surprise and was now rallying his remaining men. "Kill the cowboy and bring me those Apache heads!" he screamed over the continuing explosions and gunfire. "I'm not losing that mining money because of one interfering drifter." Jake rolled behind an overturned wagon as bullets whined overhead. He quickly reloaded his revolver while assessing the tactical situation. About 15 fake soldiers remained combat effective, though several appeared to be wounded from the explosions. The sisters had reached the rocky outcrop safely, but they were still within range of enemy fire. The cowboy knew he needed to keep the fake soldiers focused on him rather than pursuing the escaped women. He began a fighting withdrawal toward a different section of rocks, firing carefully aimed shots that forced his enemies to take cover rather than advancing. His military training served him well as he used terrain features and darkness to maximum advantage. During a brief lull in the shooting, Jake heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. His heart sank as he wondered if enemy reinforcements were arriving. But as the riders came into view, he realized these were genuine cavalry soldiers, their uniforms and discipline immediately distinguishable from the fake military unit. The real soldiers had apparently been attracted by the explosions and gunfire. Their commanding officer quickly assessed the chaotic scene and began deploying his men to surround the remaining fake soldiers. Jake took advantage of the distraction to work his way closer to where the sisters were hiding, wanting to ensure their continued safety. "Surrender your weapons!" the cavalry captain shouted to the fake soldiers. "You are surrounded and outnumbered!" The fake sergeant wasn't ready to give up his profitable scheme without a fight. He grabbed a rifle and began firing at the approaching cavalry, screaming for his men to follow his example. Several of the fake soldiers complied, but others threw down their weapons when they realized the hopelessness of their situation. A fierce gun battle erupted as the remaining fake soldiers made their last stand. Jake used the confusion to reach the sisters' position among the rocks. "Are any of you hurt?" he asked quickly, checking each young woman for injuries. "We are unharmed thanks to you," the eldest sister replied. "But why did you risk your life to save us? You don't even know our names." Jake smiled grimly as gunfire continued to echo across the desert. "Sometimes a man has to do what's right, regardless of the cost. My name is Jake Morrison." "I am Maria Santos," the eldest sister replied, using the Spanish name she had adopted when dealing with territorial officials. "These are my sisters. Our Apache names would be difficult for you to pronounce." The gun battle was winding down as superior numbers and training told in favor of the genuine cavalry. The fake sergeant made one last desperate attempt to escape, breaking from cover and running toward the horse corral. But Jake stepped into his path, revolver drawn and ready. "End of the trail, Sergeant," Jake said calmly. "Time to answer for what you've done." The fake sergeant raised his rifle, but Jake's draw was faster. The Colt revolver fired once, and the corrupt leader of the fake military unit fell to the desert floor. Justice had finally caught up with him, though his death was only the beginning of unraveling the larger conspiracy he had served. As dawn broke over the Arizona desert, the surviving fake soldiers were bound and placed under guard by the real cavalry. The 7 Apache sisters were safe, their planned execution prevented by the timely intervention of a lone cowboy who couldn't ignore injustice. But Jake Morrison was about to discover that their rescue was only the first step in exposing a corruption scheme that reached far beyond one murderous fake military unit. Captain Robert Hayes of the 7th Cavalry listened intently as Jake Morrison explained what he had overheard about the mining claims conspiracy. The seasoned officer's expression grew increasingly grim as the full scope of the corruption scheme became clear. Around them, the captured fake soldiers sat bound and sullen, their elaborate deception finally exposed. "This conspiracy goes deeper than just these hired killers," Captain Hayes said, studying the forged military documents found in the fake sergeant's belongings. These orders appear to be signed by Colonel Matthews from the Territorial Command. If they're genuine, we're dealing with corruption at very high levels. Maria Santos stepped forward. Her sisters gathered protectively around her. Despite their harrowing ordeal, she maintained her dignity and composure. Captain Hayes, my father holds legal mining claims that are worth thousands of dollars. These men plan to kill us so the claims would become available for corrupt officials to steal. Jake examined the forged documents more closely, his years of military experience helping him spot several inconsistencies. These papers aren't genuine, he announced. The signatures are wrong, and the official seals don't match what I remember from my cavalry days. Someone went to considerable trouble to create convincing fakes. Captain Hayes nodded thoughtfully. That suggests we're dealing with an organized criminal network rather than actual military corruption. The question is how many other Apache families have been victimized by this scheme. As they spoke, one of the captured fake soldiers called out desperately. "I'll tell you everything if you guarantee my protection," he shouted. "The boss will have me killed if he finds out I've been captured." Jake and Captain Hayes exchanged meaningful glances. This could be the break they needed to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. They approached the frightened prisoner, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. "What's your name, son?" Captain Hayes asked in a firm but not unkind voice. "Tommy Wright," the young man replied nervously. "I'm not really a soldier, sir. I was just trying to make some money to help my sick mother." Jake knelt beside the young prisoner. "Tommy, good men don't participate in murdering innocent women regardless of their financial problems, but if you help us stop this conspiracy, maybe we can find a way to help your mother through legal means." Tommy looked around at his fellow prisoners, most of whom were glaring at him with obvious hostility. Taking a deep breath, he made his decision. "The boss is a man named Samuel Garrett. He owns several businesses in Tucson and has connections with territorial officials. He's been targeting Apache families with valuable land or mining claims for almost 2 years now." The story that emerged from Tommy's confession was even worse than Jake had initially suspected. Garrett's criminal organization had systematically murdered dozens of Apache men and their families, always using fake military operations to provide cover for their crimes. The stolen land and mining claims were then sold to legitimate businesses who believed they were making legal purchases from the territorial government. "Garrett has a list of every Apache family with valuable property," Tommy continued. "He pays corrupt clerks in the Territorial Land Office to provide information about new claims and property transfers. Then he sends our fake military unit to eliminate the families and seize their holdings." Maria Santos stepped closer, her eyes blazing with anger and determination. "How many families has this monster destroyed?" she demanded. Tommy couldn't meet her gaze as he answered. "At least 30 families over the past 2 years, maybe more. We were told they were hostile Apache who needed to be eliminated for the safety of settlers." Jake felt his own anger building at the scope of the conspiracy. 30 families meant potentially hundreds of innocent men, women, and children had been murdered for their property. This wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was systematic genocide disguised as military action. Captain Hayes was taking careful notes of Tommy's confession. "Where can we find this Samuel Garrett?" he asked. "And what kind of security does he maintain?" "He owns a large ranch outside Tucson," Tommy replied. "But he also has a house in town where he conducts most of his business. He keeps about a dozen hired guns as personal protection, and he has friends in the territorial government who warn him about investigations." Jake realized they were facing a formidable enemy with significant resources and political connections. Simply arresting Garrett wouldn't be enough if corrupt officials could intervene to secure his release. They needed evidence that would expose the entire conspiracy and ensure justice for all the victims. "Tommy, did Garrett keep records of his operations?" Jake asked. "Account books, Property transfers, correspondence with his political allies? The young prisoner nodded eagerly. Everything's kept in a safe at his house in Tucson. He's obsessed with documenting his profits and maintaining detailed records of bribes paid to officials. Captain Hayes smiled grimly. Then we'll need to pay Mr. Garrett a visit and examine his business records. This conspiracy ends now. Over the next several hours, they developed a plan to infiltrate Garrett's operation and gather the evidence needed to bring down the entire criminal network. Jake would pose as a potential recruit for Garrett's fake military unit, using information provided by Tommy to establish his credentials. Meanwhile, Captain Hayes would coordinate with honest territorial officials to prepare for mass arrests once they had sufficient evidence. Maria Santos insisted that she and her sisters be allowed to participate in the operation. "This man murdered our friends and neighbors," she said firmly. "We have a right to see justice done." Jake initially objected, concerned about placing the sisters in further danger. But Maria's arguments were compelling, and her knowledge of other affected Apache families would be valuable for building cases against the conspirators. As they prepared to leave for Tucson, Jake found himself impressed by the courage and intelligence of the 7 sisters. They had survived a traumatic ordeal that would have broken many people, yet they remained focused on ensuring justice for their community. Maria, in particular, showed remarkable leadership qualities and an understanding of both Apache and territorial law that would prove invaluable in the coming confrontation. The journey to Tucson took 2 days, during which Jake learned more about the sisters' background and their father's legitimate business ventures. The mining claims that had made them targets were part of a larger effort by progressive Apache leaders to integrate their people into the territorial economy while maintaining their cultural identity. When they reached the outskirts of Tucson, Jake separated from the cavalry unit and made his way to Garrett's house. The criminal leader lived in an impressive adobe mansion that testified to the profits from his murderous scheme. Armed guards patrolled the grounds, but their discipline was poor compared to real military sentries. Jake presented himself as a former cavalry scout looking for employment with Garrett's organization. Using details provided by Tommy Wright, he was able to convince Garrett's lieutenants that he was genuine. Within hours, he found himself inside the mansion and positioned to gather the evidence they needed. Samuel Garrett proved to be a cold, calculating man in his 50s who spoke about murder and theft as casually as other businessmen discussed legitimate transactions. During their initial meeting, he showed Jake detailed maps marking Apache properties targeted for future acquisition and boasted about his political connections. "The territorial officials understand that progress sometimes requires difficult decisions," Garrett explained. "These Apache are sitting on valuable resources that could benefit all citizens of the territory. We're simply helping to redistribute those resources more efficiently." Jake struggled to maintain his composure while listening to Garrett's justification for mass murder. The criminal leader clearly believed his own propaganda about helping territorial development, showing no recognition of the human cost of his actions. That evening, while Garrett was entertaining corrupt territorial officials at a dinner party, Jake managed to crack open the safe containing the conspiracy's records. What he found exceeded their worst expectations. Detailed ledgers showed payments to dozens of corrupt officials, maps marked future targets among Apache communities, and correspondence revealing plans to expand operations into other territories. As Jake photographed the incriminating documents with a small camera provided by Captain Hayes, he discovered that the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Several prominent politicians and business leaders were involved in the scheme, explaining how Garrett had operated with impunity for so long. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted Jake's work. He quickly closed the safe and prepared to defend himself as Garrett's guards entered the study. But instead of discovering his deception, they brought news that would change everything. "Boss, there's trouble," one guard announced. "The cavalry is surrounding the house. Someone must have talked." Garrett's face turned pale as he realized his criminal empire was collapsing. "How many soldiers?" he demanded. "At least 50, and they have Apache guides with them," the guard replied. "One of them looks like those sisters we were supposed to eliminate last week." Jake smiled as he heard Maria Santos's voice calling for Garrett's surrender from outside the mansion. The 7 Apache sisters had indeed played a crucial role in bringing down the conspiracy that had terrorized their people. Justice was finally coming to the Arizona frontier, delivered by a lone cowboy who couldn't ignore evil and 7 brave sisters who refused to let their people's suffering continue in silence.